This is Malta, an island nation 90 miles off the southwest coast of Sicily. The Maltese archipelago consists of 3 islands: Malta, Gozo, and Comino. Malta is the largest. It is 237 square kilometers of yellow limestone, gleaming in sunlight. For thousands of years, these golden cliffs have guided ships to ports in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Malta is strategically located at the center of the Mediterranean shipping lanes. To possess Malta is to control the Mediterranean Sea. That's why Malta has been a fortress of defense for the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Knights of St. John after the Crusades, the French under Napoleon, and the Allies during the Second World War. During the Second World War, this island in the Mediterranean was known as the most bombed place on Earth. Malta's coastal waters are virtually littered with shipwrecks.
Got it.
The Zodiac leads the way past the harbor breakwater and into the open sea toward Malta's southeast coast, near the fishing village of Della Mala. This is where the team will dive 2 memorials to when this tiny rock of history and romance suffered the onslaught of the Second Great Siege of Malta. They organize the dives according to the depth of the wreck. The shallow wreck first, the deepest one last. This will help the team build up a tolerance to nitrogen narcosis before their last dive, which is to a depth of more than 60 meters. That's a dive which requires more than 30 minutes decompression before surfacing. That makes it a dangerous dive. The water is clear. Visibility is nearly 100 feet. That will make for good diving and a good chance to see the twisted remains of an unusual wreck on the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. At first sight, the wreck has all the appearance of a giant stingray, with its wings flattened on the bottom. But as the team swims closer, the wreck takes shape. This is a twin-engine bomber aircraft called a blenheim. German fighter planes had shot it down. Knowing the story behind a wreck on the bottom adds to the adventure of a dive. In June 1940, Italy joined Germany and declared war on Great Britain and the Allies. 2 weeks later, France fell to Hitler's army. All of a sudden, the western half of the Mediterranean Sea was up for grabs. Both sides had armies in North Africa and the Middle East. Both sides needed access across the Mediterranean to supply these armies. For both sides, Malta was the key. And yet, in 1940, British Air Force and Army strategists considered Malta not worth the cost in supplies and personnel to defend. Winston Churchill, however, thought otherwise. Churchill knew his history. He knew the strategic importance Malta had played throughout the centuries. Hold Malta, Churchill had ordered. Hold Malta. Malta was a thorn in the side of Hitler and Mussolini. From its naval base and airfields in Malta, British destroyers, submarines, and Blenheim bombers attacked German and Italian supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean. Germans had to crush Malta if they were to win the war in North Africa. Hitler had planned an invasion of Malta and then abandoned that plan. Instead, the German High Command decided to bomb this tiny island to dust. For Malta, 1942 was one hell of a year. In the first 6 weeks, the Germans dropped 6,700 tons of bombs on the towns surrounding Grand Harbor. 1942 was the year the Germans had decided to neutralize the island of Malta by breaking the will of its people. This has been called the Second Great Siege of Malta. It is one of the epic struggles of World War II. Despite the steady bombing of Malta, Allied airmen continued to take to the air to attack German and Italian supply convoys across the Mediterranean. The cost was high. Allied aircraft, especially Blenheim bombers, were being shot down day and night. The Blenheim was a short-range bomber with a 3-man crew: pilot, navigator, and gunner. They were armed with 6 303 machine guns, 1 in the rear turret, 1 in the nose, and 4 in the belly pod. The Blenheim carried a payload of 1,000 pounds of bombs. But against German fighter planes, the Blenheim was no match. For Allied airmen, a posting to Malta was considered a one-way ticket to hell. The low and slow-flying Blenheim bombers made for easy targets. Just getting there was risky business. During winter 1942, one Blenheim, after dropping its bombs on a supply convoy, flew safely through the teeth of anti-aircraft guns from German ships, only to encounter a German fighter plane. A machine gun blast from the fighter brought the Blenheim down. The Blenheim broke apart when it hit the water at a speed of nearly 400 kilometers an hour. Its metal skin peeled back in the crash. Propellers and cockpit cover ripped off. Pilot and crew caught the shatter of glass. The Blenheim plunged through 42 meters of water almost at once. It landed on its belly. There were no survivors. Pilot seat and control tower are all intact. It's unnerving to realize that the pilot had been sitting here when he died. The navigator had been sitting just behind. The gunner was at one of the machine guns in the belly or in the tail. It's not hard to imagine 3 young airmen flying this plane. Most of them were not much older than boys. The oldest maybe 20. This is one of the two 920 horsepower Bristol. The fuselage lies upside down a few meters away. It is partially buried in the silt. A circle of time and tragedy, repeating itself forever. The Blenheim bomber is only the first of two fascinating dives to sunken relics of the Second Great Siege of Malta. Tomorrow, the team will dive and film another fabulous wreck. They'll dive what few divers ever get to see on the bottom. A tribal-class British destroyer. Many ships sank during the Second Great Siege. The tribal-class British destroyer, HMS Maori. It lies in 17 meters of water across the bay from Fort St. Elmo. It sank in February 1942. Divers descend through liquid turquoise. The diffusion of sunlight seems to throw a thin web over what lies below. At 30 feet down, the water starts to cool, and cool quickly, to 11 degrees Celsius. The divers swim over the wreck's debris field, which marks the way to the sunken ship. The wreck appears almost ghostly. The steel hull is brown with silt. It's like a time capsule wrapped in gossamer. The divers negotiate their way to starboard and along the stoved hull, which is covered in silt. The port side has been swallowed by a sandy slope. However, the bow and starboard sides are accessible. This was the swivel base of a gun turret, and below is what's left of Maori's shattered past. HMS Maori was a British destroyer which had performed distinguished service. When war broke out, Maori did escort duty for convoys in the Mediterranean, and then the North Sea and across the Atlantic. In early 1941, Maori played a part in the hunt and sinking of the famous German battleship Bismarck. She was even on hand to pick up Bismarck's survivors. In late 1941, Maori played her most important role in the war. Maori intercepted 2 Italian cruisers which were supplying Rommel's tank corps in North Africa. The Italian cruisers were 50 200-ton warships, and they packed more firepower than a British destroyer. Maori surprised the convoy and opened fire. One torpedo hit a cruiser in its midsection. The other exploded in the stern. The Italian cruiser sank almost at once. Another torpedo hit the second cruiser and exploded several drums of petrol. The cruiser burst into flames, and all hands abandoned ship. The closed-in feeling has a way of turning the mind to wonder what memories hide beyond the break of daylight. What visions cower just beyond a diver's view? The team explores the lower deck of this tribal-class British destroyer. It sank off the island of Malta in February 1942. Knowing the story of Maori's sinking, and now seeing where their crew sat and slept, and seeing the exploded hull up close, has left a vivid impression of the ugliness of war. After sinking 2 Italian cruisers, Maori steamed into Grand Harbor to a hero's welcome. 2 months later, however, Maori was to get as good as she gave. She was moored to a buoy in the middle of the harbor, near what was called French Creek. Several other ships were at anchor nearby. February 12, 1942, air raid sirens blew, and anti-aircraft guns lighted the night sky. Germans took us dived vertically at their targets and released their cargo of bombs at the bottom of the dive. They were accurate to within 30 meters. One of them bombed Maori. It scored a direct hit on the engine room. The explosion instantly killed one of the few crew members on board. Fire broke out and quickly spread. Onboard ammunition exploded. Water poured through holes in the hull. The few on board worked like mad to shut the bulkheads and fight the flames. They risked their lives doing it. But there was just too much damage and too much water pouring in for them to keep Maori from sinking. Maori listed to port, and as the last of the crew abandoned ship, she slipped to the bottom of Grand Harbor. So often war stories romanticize the ugliness of battle. But this wrecked ship on the bottom is anything but romantic. The collapsed deck has narrowed the space inside. It's a twilight world inside this wreck, with its gray shapes scattered and shattered. The light seems to enter the wreck slowly, unwillingly. The collapsed deck now has the space getting narrower and narrower. Getting inside was easy. Now it seems as though the wreck does not want to let him out. Once outside the hatch, the team leaves Maori to its shadows and its gray light, and to that moment in 1942 when enemy planes splintered the night sky and bled destruction over this tiny island. Malta is a living memorial to courage under siege. Its forts and churches and rebuilt cities pay tribute to the Maltese people, who were determined and unbending throughout the worst of it. If not for their bravery, this strategic island with British naval base and airfields may have been lost to the Axis powers, and with it the Mediterranean, North Africa, and very possibly the war. The shipwrecks of Malta are memorials as well. They pay tribute to those who defended this island and who shared with the Maltese people the spirit of no surrender, of never giving in, no matter how tough it gets. Diving these wrecks, touching them, and for an instant reliving their glory and their tragedy, it has been an honor.